Very good. Well, good evening. If you're visiting with us, welcome. We're studying in the book of John. And tonight we'll be looking at John chapter 6. And if I were to have you guess which Bible story I refer to, and I give you some elements or hints, let's say. And I say, okay, there's people on a journey, there's a water crossing, and then there's free food and drink. What story would you think I'm referring to? Well, I'm talking about the Exodus, and well, in John 6 reads like an overlay of the Exodus journey. Now, we read about the 5,000, or the bedtime stories are frequently, we talk about the 5,000, we talk about Jesus walking over the water, on the water. And these are good bedtime stories, and there's like three parts to John 6. There's these two stories that we all know and love and tell our children. But the third part, we don't go there very much. It is difficult language and hard to explain to a child. But nevertheless, for me, it was extremely difficult. And yes, I thought this might be a good night to call in sick and have Dan or Tim explain this one. But we are on a journey as the Exodus, but demonstrating that Jesus is superior to Moses on this journey leading to an everlasting life. And the attention to detail is, to me, further evidence of the power of the Spirit guiding the hand of the apostle, John, who wrote this. And it's highly figurative in that third part, as we mentioned. But if you will keep in mind as we go through the chapter that we'll be looking at the themes that are introduced in John chapter 1. And I wish I had a whiteboard. I'd put all the themes up here, but I'd just like to remind us before we get into it from John chapter 1. Beginning in verse 12, 13, he says, "As many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." Verse 16, and we'll see this as we go through the study tonight. His fullness, Christ, of course, we have all received, and grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So, let's go to the reading. Let's just read the first together, the first about 15 verses in chapter 6, and then we'll discuss it and break it down. But as we read it, try to keep in mind what elements do you see that remind you of the Exodus in this passage. After these things, Jesus went over to the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs, which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" And this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Well, what are they among so many?" And Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign which Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who has come into the world." Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. So, a lot there, and let's just go back to the very beginning and have a look at it in more detail. The first note I had was this comment about the Sea of Galilee, but he also calls it the Sea of Tiberias. What does that kind of remind you of? Just like John's post-it note to us, don't forget something. Well, who was the emperor at the time of Jesus? Tiberius. So, it's like, don't forget that we're talking about a kingdom of men in opposition to the kingdom of God that Jesus is constructing or forming. And so don't forget the influence of the Roman world in which these people lived during this time. The next thing, in verse 2, what do you see in verse 2 that would remind you of the Exodus? And this might be a little more arcane than some other things we'll get to. Healing. I went back and just, like I said, I overlaid John 6 with the Exodus story. And it's interesting to see in Exodus chapter 15, verse 26, God tells the people to listen to him, do what's right, and I will keep the diseases off of you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. Well, Jesus is there healing. So you see that correlation between what God said and what Jesus is doing in this chapter. What other thing do you see that reminds you of somebody in the Exodus? Verse 3. Right, up on the mountain. So where did Moses go? Up on the mountain. What about the part, though, about his disciples? How many disciples were there? 12. How many tribes were with Moses? 12. So that number was going to pop up again, and we'll see that as we go through the passage. What about verse 4? What elements do you see? And these are like little word clues that he puts in there to remind us of the Exodus. Verse 4 and 5, what do you see in there? Passover? Exactly. So, of course, the first Passover was before the Exodus. So he's kind of putting these little placeholders up here to remind us of these things. And next, verse 6 and 7. What about this part about a test? Was there a test of some sort during the Exodus? There were a couple of tests. One, he's testing their faith as they are approaching the sea, and they're gathered up by the sea, and the Egyptian army's coming. That's a test. And specifically, he says in Exodus chapter 16, and of course this is about feeding, and this is directly related to this. He says, behold, this is 16 verse 4, Exodus. Behold, I am about to rain heaven from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they walk in my way, in my law or not. So you see that correlation again right here. You remember, and let me ask this, do you think Philip and the other disciples who were listening to this, do they pass their test or fail the test? Maybe a little bit difficult question to answer right away, but think about, this is kind of what I call a social crisis. Think about the other example of a social situation in Cana. And they ran out of the wine, And what did Jesus do? Right, he changed the water to wine, provided this miracle to do that. Well, who asked him to do that? His mother Mary. And think about, just compare what's going on here. Compare what Mary did and the faith that she demonstrated to what the apostles did at this time, or disciples. Right. It's heading that way. But they didn't say, Jesus, with all the things you can do, let's come up with some. Right. And that's the essence of the test, I believe, Bob. Thank you. Okay. And then he goes on down, next couple of verses, have the people sit down. And then in verse 11, he takes the loaves and he gives thanks. And then he distributed them to those who were seated, also the fish, as much as they wanted. So they had bread and fish as much as they wanted. And listen to Exodus chapter 16:16. This is what the Lord commanded. Gather of it, each of you, as much as he can eat. So it's almost like an overlay again of this with the giving of the food before the Exodus. And as much as you can eat, did they have to pay for this? Of course not. It was given to them. And just as Moses was leading them to a better place, they were missing the old place. I flipped over to Numbers, talking about fish. He said, we remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. Well, it reminds you of the theme that we talked about, grace over grace, right? They're getting these gifts for nothing. Well, that's exactly what grace is it not? Being fulfilled in Christ, but it was not. It was a shadow of things to come with Moses. Well, they were missing Egypt back in the Exodus, but this is not going to happen again in the same way, is it? As they say, well, let's stay tuned and go on with this. Verse 12 and 13, notice what Jesus said, gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. And so how many baskets did they collect? 12. And of course we understand the significance of 12. What, 12 tribes, right? 12 apostles. And were any of the 12 tribes lost in the Exodus? No. They all crossed. And it's also a reference to what Jesus will say, no, we're not there yet, but in John chapter 17 and John 18, he's going to say almost exactly the same thing about his apostles. So it's just a transition, a continuity from the beginning of John chapter 1 all the way through the book of John. And he'll say, none were lost, but he will say, except for one, as per the prophecy in Psalm 109. And that's a prophecy from the King David. David as the prophet in this case. That's a good point. It's unlimited grace in that case, if you apply it spiritually to what he's showing us or demonstrating physically. Right. Right. Yeah. And yes, and to make it clear, the miracle had happened, right? Next verse, the people say, this is indeed the prophet. And we talked about this on Sunday from, if you recall, from Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, when Moses says, the Lord will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. So underscoring that again in this chapter. Verse 15, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew to the mountain by himself alone. And of course, this we mentioned already. We're going back to the image of Moses going up to the mountain alone to meet with God. So, let's look at some things before we move on, some notes about this. Right, exactly. Excellent point. And it's to me, it's ironic that they want to make him king because God has already appointed him to be their king, right? But it's a little bit of an unusual thing, and I think in their minds, just like you say, for one thing, if he was only the prophet, how can he be only the prophet from Nazareth, which we'll see later, that's all they thought about, and make him king? He wouldn't qualify to be king, to sit on the throne of David in their mind, I'm saying. Of course, he did. But then the other part, Gene, that you mentioned, is that what kind of king do they want? Well, what did Jesus say? Why did they come? He's going to mention it again. We're not quite there yet, but I think it's okay to jump ahead because we need to tie these things together. They followed him because he was healing them. They were bringing their sick mother or father or whatever, or themselves, and trying to be healed by Christ. And then later he said, you just came to be fed. So if you think about that, and like you said, well, they want a king that will provide all these physical benefits, right? Health and wealth. Sounds like a mega church. The foundation of a mega church going on here, doesn't it? Well, if that is all they want, period, full stop on that, and those kind of things in their mind, that becomes the metaphor in Exodus of what? What do we see in Exodus that would apply to this? Made out of gold. The golden calf. I mean, that's kind of the metaphor for what the kind of king that they want, I think, at this time. Right. If you put all the pieces together, I think that's kind of the picture that you see. Sorry. Oh, right. Couldn't get away. Right. And that's going to be so, the contrast, and that's the contrast being made here. The physical nature of what they want, trying to go on a spiritual journey, and minimizing the desires of the flesh to accelerate or accentuate the needs that we need spiritually. Bob. Right. Exactly. And it goes back to John chapter 2 when he said that, when he was cleansing the temple and they were trying to elevate him then. He said he wouldn't have anything to do with that type of thing or notion. So now we get to the next miracle or sign, which would be what, number 5, I think, that we've gotten to so far. Of course, the feeding of the 5,000 was the 4th in the sequence. And we won't go through all that, but just to kind of get our minds in that direction. But look at, and I'm going to read this word for word. I don't think we need to do that really, but think about the images. Just glance through it, if you will, or think about from your prior reading. What elements in here that remind you of the Exodus? How did God open the sea? What does it say? Well, he Overnight, this east wind came. So what do you see in this? There's a wind that comes up. And of course, there's fear in the disciples. And rather than opening up and walking on dry land, there's a miracle involved to get to the other side. But instead of Moses opening up or God opening up the ocean for them to walk over, Jesus walks on the water, right? So there is fear and relief. I equate that to just like the Israelites were fearful and rejoicing. Fearful on one side of the water, rejoicing on the other side. And you see the same thing here in this passage. So who got across? How many people got across with Jesus? The disciples he was with on the mountain, they come down, all of them get in a boat. Again, you see how many? 12. And we know this. I'm not guessing. Jesus says this in verse 70 at the end. So you haven't maybe looked ahead. Sorry. But it's 12. And he goes back to the point he made. None of them will be lost. It just keeps, that concept keeps showing up over and over in the book of John. So some little things that are notable, perhaps. He mentioned specifically, and Dan brought this up in his overview, that they were rowing 3 or 4 miles. It's very detailed, and it's evidence that what Dan mentioned, that it was evidence that John wrote the book, or this gospel. And it's interesting to me that they knew the lake. They could navigate at night. They were out there in the evening. They didn't go out until it was dark, it says. So throughout all this, and one thing I noticed in reading through John, he never calls the disciples the 12 apostles, ever. But you see it in Matthew, Luke, Mark, but you don't see it in John. You don't see it in 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. Why is that, do you think? Well, he calls them disciples. Yes. Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. You said it better than I was thinking it. He is focusing on discipleship, is he not? That's what he's emphasizing, I think, and that's why he didn't call himself an apostle or the other disciples apostles in any of his writings. So anyway, just a kind of a sideline point, but I think it's worth noticing those kind of things. Think about in verse 21. Now, they then, after all this commotion in the water and so forth, then when they saw Jesus coming, they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. What theme does that demonstrate to us? From chapter 1. Willingly received. Well, the words tell you what theme we're talking about, doesn't it? And so that's a spiritual concept, though, that he's referring to. He's using this to demonstrate how we should receive him spiritually, I believe. But what did it take for them to receive him willingly, and what does it take for us to receive him willingly, or anybody? Well, think about the situation they were in. What were they thinking? What were they in at the moment? They saw the wind and the waves. They were in danger. And they realized we can sink. We can die in this storm tonight. And then comes who? Jesus. And all of a sudden things become better. Things smoothed out. And it says immediately they were at the shore. They were at the place where they needed to be when they received Jesus. And I think that's a lesson for us. Would we be as apt to receive Jesus if we never had any difficulties in life? Paul talks about hardships, so I think it's an indication or a lesson that, without some difficulties in life, and realizing that we have that need, we would never seek and reach out to somebody to help us. We wouldn't look for that solution. So I think that's one of the first steps in receiving Jesus and becoming what we need to be, is realizing we're in danger. Yes, Daryl? Right. Right. That little cloud popped up in my head too, and what Daryl was saying was that a miraculous immediate thing that they were in safety or at the shoreline. And it's a good thought, good question. It could be. Right. 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 Good. Well, we continue the journey. We cross the water, and it turns out the journey with Moses didn't turn out so well, but now we have one greater than Moses. So I think it's kind of, let's pause here and think about what would a Jew in the late in the first century or into the second century read this and understand about Jesus in relation to him being greater than Moses and worthy of following and believing and having faith in Jesus, and that their journey's not in vain. So what are the things we just saw? Well, start out in chapter 1, healing the sick. Did Moses do that? Right. 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 Hmm. Right. Right. And the feeding itself, I mean, Jesus created something out of nothing. And it's almost like a little microcosm of the creation itself. How did he do that? He willed it into existence, just like God spoke the creation into existence. So there's that aspect of it as well. So, yeah. Hmm. Right. They weren't making it. Right. 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 would would understand that, right? It would make a real deep impression on them, more so. And you're right, I wish I had a map of the lake as well to show these things. That's a good point. And the fact, and to your point about 3 or 4 miles, it wasn't that he walked across the water maybe 50 yards and stopped and, or something like that. It was, you know, uh, yeah. Hmm. Right. Correct. Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like what Bob was saying, to emphasize the incredible miracle. It was more food than they needed, and this distance is mentioned as well to underscore the nature of the miracle again. So, those are the fun parts that we like to read to our children. Now we get into what I call the third part, and there might be subsets of part 3, but the last part of the chapter. But beginning in verse 22, from 22 to about 24, the people are crossing over the next day into Capernaum, and for what? In verse 24, they arrive in Capernaum, and they're there to what? They're doing what? Maybe a better way to say it. They're seeking Jesus in the last part of verse 24. And they say in 25, and when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? And Jesus answered and said, most assuredly, I say to you that you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Well, that goes back to the point we had made just a few minutes ago. And also to what Bob said, Jesus knew what was in man, as we discussed. Verse 27, we'll keep reading and pause again after a few verses. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. And then he said to him, what shall we do that we may work the works of God? And Jesus answered and said to them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent. Therefore they said to him, what sign will you perform then that we may see and believe you? What work will you do? Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, and it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Now, you probably noticed the word choices that Jesus made throughout here. First, I'll go back to labor, Jesus says, and they are thinking maybe, what do you mean by labor? And so they reply, our fathers ate food that was given, and there was no payment for this. We didn't have to labor. And then he uses another word that's related to labor, work, Jesus says. And they at first accept it, but then he says it again, and they say, work? You mean we need to work? And it's almost, the way I view it, it's like almost, at this point, it's almost a sarcastic response. They throw it back at him and say, well, what work are you going to do? And you can kind of see their teeth are already getting on edge a bit. And then he comes up with this interesting comment that God the Father has set his seal on him, being those who endure for everlasting life. Where do we see this seal, God putting a seal on somebody again? And it's only two places I can find in Scripture, here in John and where else? Well, good point. I may have missed that one, but I was thinking way toward the end of the Bible, written by John. But it wasn't John, it's in Revelation chapter 20, verse 3, where it says that God set a seal on him that he should deceive the nations no more, but he also puts a seal on us that he knows who we are. He knows his own. So this word, this concept about putting a seal on something, certifying who the enemy is, certifying who we are, that we're God's people. So it's an interesting point, I think. Yes. Okay. I see what you mean. So the seal is talking specifically about Jesus. I accept your comment. Yeah, I see it. I see what you're talking about, because You're right, but then later he's going to put his seal on us and certify who we are as well. Okay. And then think about this. Going back to verse 31, when the Jews are talking again. Our fathers ate manna in the desert, and it says, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Who's the he in this verse, in their minds? Right. Somebody said Moses. Thank you. Yes, because in verse 32, he responds this way. He said, for sure I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, so that's the he in verse 31. But my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. Continuing in verse 33, for the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. Well, in verse 32, there's two things that we notice. One, he says, my Father. And it goes back, if you recall, from chapter 5, Dan covered this, and verse 18, that he said something very similar to that. And he said, well, you're making yourself equal to God with that comment. Yes, Tim. Okay. Just a snapshot of what Tim said. So the work of God is so to help us believe, or that we might believe in Jesus. The second thing, and going back, just to recap what I said, that he's equating himself to the Father, and also he elevates himself, or it's implied he's greater than Moses as well in this passage. When you look through verses 33 through 35, we heard something similar to this in a previous encounter with Jesus. It sounds very much like the opening line with what Jesus was saying or telling the woman at the well. And it's interesting how God, if you combine all this, it's interesting how God underscores the wisdom of God, in that he designed our bodies with physical needs to emphasize our spiritual needs. And he exchanges this all the time. And what I mean by that, if you think about what he said to the woman at the well and what he's saying here, the water becomes what? Living water to quench our spiritual thirst. Bread made from grain then becomes bread of God, bread of life. And so you think about that Jesus is replacing the needs of the body with the needs of the spirit. You recall what he said after the conversation he had with the woman at the well. The disciples come, bring food. They tell Jesus to have some food, And what does Jesus say? My food is what? To do the will of the Father. Exactly. Right. Right. It's one of those kind of things when you get off by yourself, out raking leaves or fishing or whatever you do, and you think about those things. Is my food to do the will of the Father? or not? And am I serving? But anyway, it's something to think about. Continue on in verse 36 through 45, and we may have to kind of summarize this, but he's, yes, It is a good point. Yes, right, right. Not just for the Jews, and that's the fulfillment of the prophecy, isn't it? That all nations would be blessed. Okay. So, I need about another 30 minutes, but we only have 5. So we'll just kind of take a look at this, 36 through 45, or 30, let's do just a few verses. Beginning in verse 36, but I said to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given me, I should lose nothing. That phrase again pops up. But should raise up at the last day. And this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up in the last day. So much about the last day. Jesus will say this 4 times in this chapter about the last day and about raising him up on the last day. And what is he talking about? What's the one word that we use to capture this concept? The resurrection. And he talks about that, and I think Dan and Don discussed this when Dan did the class in chapter 5 about those who hear his voice will come forth to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. So he makes that point. When he's talking about being the judge, he's going to be the judge on that final day as well. So these are marvelous and powerful, and maybe even to some who were reading it back in that day, shocking statements. And those who are maybe more concerned about seeking food for the body, are they understanding this about the Father sent me, the Father's will, what the Father will give? And who are the ones that the Father gives? Look in verse, yeah. Right, right. Verse 40, I think, sort of gives you a couple words that sort of tie in with what Tim said. Everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life. Those are the ones he'll raise up on that last day. Okay. Down to verse 44, 45, we might be able to cover this quickly. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Therefore, everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. That is a prophecy, and they shall all be taught by God. Where does that come from? Right, Isaiah. That's in Isaiah chapter 54, 13 through 14, that they all should be taught by God. In righteousness you shall be established, and you shall not fear. And it not sort of, but it ties in with what the writer of Hebrews says in the beginning of Hebrews. That God, at various times, spoke through the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things. And it also ties in with what we already said from Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, that God will raise up a prophet like me. It is to him you shall listen. So, unfortunately, there's no more listening to me. We're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you for the comment.